Good evening and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And if you follow the news lately, without getting indigestion, which might be hard, you're probably wondering about what's going on in the country and can we make sense of some of these things that are happening. So tonight, we're going to try to do exactly that. My guest tonight is Ed Yohnka, Director of Communications and Public Policy at the ACLU of Illinois. So Ed, how are we going to make sense of all this stuff?
Well, it's a little difficult, to be sure. I think that, you know, as my colleague and my boss, Colleen Connell, like to say, the American people in their infinite wisdom have elected really probably the most constitutionally ignorant president in the history of our country. And it really, while I think the election and the campaign itself focused on a number of issues, I don't think that necessarily many voters completely thought through what the implications of some of these policy proposals would be once they were put into place. And, you know, so as an organization and I think as a country, you know, we're really in the position of struggling through those things, trying to make sense of them, and really attempting to hold the line on some basic constitutional norms that have guided our country, you know, for generations.
Well, one we talked about before the show, in particular, is immigration, and how this has not really played out the way it was promised during the campaign. You mentioned the example of a case in Southern Illinois.
Right. So if you think about the campaign, the president's very tough line on immigration was often, you know, peppered with language about bad guys or, you know, famously bad hombres. Who were going to be removed from the country. And the notion is that there was somehow this plethora of you know, criminal immigrants that were just waiting to be deported that nobody had thought of in the past of ever doing this before Donald Trump came along and suggested it. You know, one of his famous lines, of course, is nobody ever talks about something that everybody has talked about forever.
Who knew healthcare would be so hard?
Who knew healthcare would be so hard?
Yeah.
You know, nobody talks about the fact that Lincoln was a Republican. I don't know if you know that or not, which is another one I love. But one of the things that's happened in practice is that the president and his appointees have driven this idea about deporting as many people as possible from the country. And what happens, of course, in that context is you don't end up deporting the quote-unquote bad hombre. What you end up doing is deporting people who are law-abiding, citizen or residents in the United States, you know, who often have families, jobs, and contribute to the society. The example that I mentioned before we went on the air is there's a small town down near Carbondale, Illinois, in Southern Illinois, where I think it was upwards of 90 or 95% of the community voted for President Trump, and in some measure because of the immigration policies, the idea that we were going to, you know, keep, you know, jobs for Americans and et cetera. Well, it turns out one of the first people taken into custody and headed for deportation is a man who owns the community restaurant and is a pillar of the community, contributes to education, you know, youth baseball, all kinds of programs, and no one can figure out why it is that he's being targeted because he's not one of the people we said we were going to get. Well, of course, when you unleash the power of the government to go after people, they don't discern between the good and the bad. They simply take the people they can find. And this guy had been going and checking in with immigration officials for years, and so he was easy to find because he came to them. And that's the problem with this stuff is, you know, look, we have a broken immigration system. We have an immigration system that, you know, doesn't do a good job of keeping up numerically with the number of workers we actually need in the country. We have an immigration system that doesn't elevate the notion of keeping families together in the way it should. And we have an immigration system which can often be arbitrary based on the part of the country you're in, whether or not you're interacting with agents, whether or not you're, you know, taken into custody by this authority or that authority. And instead of fixing the system, what we've essentially done is now we are accentuating and turning loose all of the worst parts of the system. And that's not something that I think is really going to help people be they newcomers to the country or frankly other workers, residents, and people who just are trying to make their way through life every day.
But the Supreme Court seems to have backed that, or at least they're not opposing that kind of action at this point. So how do we deal with that? I mean, I understand that the case hasn't really come to the Supreme Court for a decision yet, but they have not allowed these injunctions that stopped it from from being held.
Right. Right. In the particular instance of the travel ban that the president proposed, there's two things. There's a couple of things that have happened, and just to kind of review, the president issued the travel ban that began on January 28th of this year, and of course, because the ban went immediately into effect, it created havoc at airports all across the country. There also was a great lack of understanding about how to implement it, who was to be affected. So you had everything from, U.S. citizens who had naturalized to people with green cards to people who had legitimate visas and were not from any of the covered countries who were stopped, detained, and questioned for long periods of time. You had people who were turned away not because they really were even subject to the ban, but simply because Customs and Border Patrol agents were given the discretion to make these kinds of decisions. Not a court, not some official in Washington, D.C., but some guy literally just working at O'Hare was given the power to decide who came in and who didn't. And so what happened is the courts enjoined and essentially paused that ban, said it was an unconstitutional infringement upon people based on their religion. The president issued a second ban. That ban was enjoined. That challenge has now gone up to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court did an interesting thing. The Supreme Court said that they would not subject the president to the injunction, that they would let the administration enforce the ban. But then they narrowed it and said they would only allow the ban to be enforced against people who either did not have a long-standing relationship with a group or organization if they were a refugee in the United States, or alternately, if they didn't have a close or near relative. The administration interpreted that in a way that was almost incomprehensible, so that your grandmother was not a near relative, but your brother-in-law was. I will just say both my parents are gone, but if you told them they were not a near relative of their grandchildren, they would be angry.
Yeah.
As
most grandparents would.
As most grandparents would. Yes. And so what ended up happening was the court has now reconfigured that definition. Grandparents are now covered.
Okay, right.
Those existing relationships, oftentimes, or ongoing relationships with refugee organizations are being honored. So the number of people who are actually affected by this ban, if it's in effect, or to the extent it's in effect, is really quite minuscule. There's another element of this, though, that the court did that I think is really important. On January 28th, so 200 days ago, when the president issued the first ban, it was only for 90 days so that his administration could figure out what kind of vetting procedures they wanted to add on top of the already strict vetting procedures that people go through to come to the U.S. And what the court said, one of the questions that the court is going to take up in October when they hear this case is whether or not the administration even needs this ban any longer, given the fact that they've now had more than 100 days, almost twice as long as they said they needed in order to do this, and that, in fact, if this was about just simply looking at those procedures, then there shouldn't be any reason for this to be in place any longer. Whatever additional procedures are necessary for vetting should already be in place. So the court will really take up a question both of the constitutionality of the ban, but also of its practical effect and whether or not it's necessary. And I think, the fact that the court allowed it to go into effect in this limited fashion, I would not necessarily think will impact ultimately what will be the outcome.
Well, so following this idea of the courts intervening, and we'll come back to immigration or deportation, really, the opposite of immigration.
Right.
So we've got these two sides. We've got immigration, we've got people coming in, trying to get into the country, many, now a small percentage, but the effort to restrict who can come in. And at the same time, we've got the effort to expel a lot of people who are already here. Given that immigrants, how much they're covered by existing law is open to question. Whether they have the same constitutional rights that everyone else has, I think there's some room for interpretation there.
Well, actually, just on
Go
that
ahead.
point, I would say, I would encourage you or your viewers to do a very simple thing, which is read the Bill of Rights and look at the word that's not in there.
Citizen.
The word citizen never appears. The word people or persons appears regularly, but the word citizen never appears. What is clear is once you are in this country, the founders and the framers intended for us to apply the laws equally to people, whether they were citizens, whether they were born citizens, whether they were naturalized citizens, or whether they were immigrants. And I think one of the things
As long as you weren't a slave.
As long as you weren't a slave. And one of the things that I think has become troubling is that there are these efforts to argue somehow that, you know, the requirements for due process, for example, for really meaningful review of an immigration case aren't the kinds of things that the Constitution requires. So in some cases, and sadly, in some cases, the courts have permitted, you know, again, a kind of a lower level authority at the port or at the airport to decide an asylum claim, which is, you know, an incredibly complex thing based on, you know, a number of facts and a number of circumstances. But that person at that level can decide whether or not they think that someone has a credible threat and whether or not they ought to come into the country. So, you know, there's been this chipping away, I would, the way I would characterize it is there has been this chipping away from, I think, what has traditionally been our fundamental notion that when people, especially when they're in trouble, that we're going to allow them to enter the United States. And we can assess along the way whether or not that's appropriate, but that we weren't going to turn people away, especially coming from war-torn areas or other places that are rife with violence, on just the sheer fear that, you know, at some point that person might be subjected to additional violence. And that seems to be the thing that we've kind of moved away from in what I personally think is a really corrosive and destructive way.
Well, speaking of moving away from things,
Yes.
Before the show we talked about the appointment of Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, and how that is how that is moving us away from, as I think you phrased it, we used to think of the Justice Department as defending rights, and now it seems as though they're restricting rights.
Right.
So talk about what that means for us as a country and how we deal with that.
Yeah, I think there's a number of different areas we can talk about this, but I would just sort of highlight you know, three things. So, for example, we've been engaged as a country for at least the last 5 years since Ferguson in a great discussion across the country about how we want policing to look in this country. We, I think, have all understood that there was a racial bias, that whether it was implicit or explicit, and not every officer had it, and not, you know, it wasn't the same everywhere, but there was this level of, you know, kind of institutional bias that we saw in policing that people believed we ought to address. And one of the ways we did it was by creating more oversight of police agencies all across the country. And so in many cities, you know, you had this thing where the police department would reach an agreement with the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice would oversee a consent decree. Jeff Sessions doesn't like consent decrees and doesn't believe that the federal government has any role in local policing. And he keeps talking about the way in which we fight violence is to, quote unquote, to loosen the shackles from our police, which, you know, we heard the President of the United States recently suggest that that means misconduct and abuse.
Yeah, don't protect the head when you put him in the car.
You're putting someone in the car. So I think that that's one element and one way in which this role that the Department of Justice has had in kind of leading this national debate, Sessions is just simply withdrawn from. Likewise, the department has recently announced a desire to examine the question of whether or not, so-called affirmative action programs or programs of that nature at elite universities are harmful, and whether or not people have been discriminated against as a result.
Well, particularly white people. But
well, that's
also
what I was going to
Asians,
say.
right.
The problem is that what that means is white people being discriminated against. And again, we've thought of government and the Department of Justice as being this device for kind of leveling the playing field, for sort of creating opportunities, for assuring that people are behaving in a way that opens up society for all of us. And again, it's this thing of shrinking that role, of withdrawing from that traditional role, of saying that they aren't going to play that role. And the last thing I'd mention that we see recently from the department is, of course, just as something as simple as, I think, the growing recognition, whether you look at polling, policy, or really the dialogue across the country, this growing recognition that our drug laws are out of sync with the real danger that's posed by drugs. That in fact, if you look at from its simplest form, that I think most people believe in almost any public opinion poll, almost anywhere in the country, that marijuana ought to be taxed and regulated as opposed to
I think
subject
you're right.
to
there are
criminal
majorities
activity.
throughout the country.
Majorities, or,
Right.
or certainly strong pluralities
Right.
across the country that support that. Jeff Sessions actually talks about going after the states that have legalized marijuana through federal law enforcement because he doesn't like those policies.
This is the same party that defends states' rights.
Well, states' rights is a slippery slope, and
Yeah.
it sort of depends. They say on whose ox is being gored
Yes.
in that case as to whether or not people often support that notion. So you see in those policies, I think we saw last week, although there's now a little bit of a pushback against this, where the president's first response to the opioid crisis was to suggest that somehow if we could criminalize and stop more people from using drugs, we could keep that crisis in check, and now there seems to be some reversal on that. But these are policies and things that people have begun to recognize. This is 30 years or 40 years or 50 years of this drug war that's not working, and that we ought to turn and go in a different direction. And we have this administration comes in and suggests that the work that's been done over really the last two administrations in this area is not something that they're going to follow through on, and in fact they're going to revert back to old policies. I think those kinds of things are really dangerous. And as we were talking before the show, it's ironic in its own way that Jeff Sessions should be the cabinet official who's attacked, because in many ways he's carrying out the very policies that the president articulated as supporting in some of these areas when he was on the campaign trail.
Yes, but he recused himself from the one that Trump seems to care most about, which is the Russia investigation.
I believe that may be the source of all of this discomfort between the two of them, yes.
I'm willing to bet that you're right on that. Yeah. Well, let's segue quickly from that. Not that there isn't a huge amount to talk about in that subject. But we also talked a little bit about voting rights.
Right.
Something else that seems to be going backwards.
Right.
Just as a preface, this political speculation about this is that this is an attempt to lock in the power of a shrinking demographic in the United States, who are losing political power because the country is diversifying, and it's just a natural form that we are. It comes back to immigration. Why do you want to cut down on immigration? Because you don't want diversification. Why do you cut down on voting rights? Because you don't want those people voting, right? So let's talk a little bit about what's going on there, particularly the new, what's the name of the committee that's investigating voter fraud?
The Voter Integrity Commission, as it's called,
yeah,
which is interesting in and of itself. So there's, Kevin, it's really interesting. Remember that much of this activity really goes to both the kind of baseless speculation that the president engaged in before the election, where he talked about things being rigged. Everything was rigged or going to be rigged. If he lost, it wouldn't be because he lost, it would be because it was all rigged against
In
him.
fact, he implied that he wouldn't accept the
Right.
results.
It's right, yeah, which was extraordinary, even in and of itself. Um, and I guess I would say I'm not sure he has completely accepted the results, even as they are.
Yes.
But the other part was, of course, the president lost the popular vote by more than 3 million people. He answered that by suggesting, and the truth is that we don't elect a president by popular vote in this
Right.
country. We elect them by the Electoral College. He won that. He's the president of the United States. Nobody questions that.
Right.
And what happened, of course, was he then went on to speculate that there were some 3 million people who had voted illegally. It's just coincidental that it's the number that he lost by, and that is why he lost the popular vote. In response to that, because nobody could find any evidence that that's true, the administration formed this commission on voter integrity, which is headed up by the Vice President of the United States and a guy by the name of Chris Kobach from Kansas. He's the Secretary of State in Kansas, and he has also been called the king of voter suppression. He has implemented a number of policies in Kansas that are intended to keep people from actually being allowed to vote. In fact, the federal court has found him in contempt and personally fined him for some of these activities, which for those of you who follow the law is an extraordinary thing for a court to do, to actually fine someone individually for their public activities.
So what's some of the damage that this commission could do? Why do we need to be concerned about it?
I think there's two things that we should look at that are particularly troubling. The first is they are seeking essentially the voter rolls from all election jurisdictions across the country.
But much of that information is publicly available anyway.
Much of that information is public, but there is information that even when it's sought by a political party or from somebody else is withheld. So things like even the last 4 digits of the Social Security number of someone, that kind of information is often withheld. The commission has actually asked for everything that people have, and that's one of the reasons why I think upwards of 43 states instantly said that they wouldn't comply when the commission asked for that information. So there is
even states run by Republican administrations.
Actually, even states run by Republican administrations, and even states that had representatives serving on the commission from the electoral authority in those states said that it violated their state's laws to participate in this way. So one of the things that we have is this effort to get all of this data, to sort of manipulate it, to be able to present some kind of case that suggests this widespread amount of voter fraud. I think there's a second thing that's even more dangerous, which is that I think the commission will come out with a series of recommendations that may well be adopted by a Congress or by state legislatures across the country, which are vastly more dangerous in terms of reducing the number of people who vote. There are estimates that somewhere up to 200,000 people were not able to vote in Wisconsin in the presidential election because of the requirements for a photo ID. So you could see the adoption of either photo IDs in more states or perhaps even a national identification card to vote.
Stop you there for just a second, because that number of 200,000 is questioned by a source. So can we rely on a number like that? I mean, because I think it's important to understand the scale of, of voter disenfranchisement that actually does occur.
Yep.
And I'm not arguing that it doesn't. I think we've seen that it does. Going back to Bush v. Gore in Florida, and probably before that. But isn't it important, if we're going to make an argument, that we get the numbers right? And if 200,000 was really 20 or whatever number it was, is it important to get it right?
Well, it is. I think what's more important, though, let me say this. I think the number is important. I think what's more important is to look at the way in which the policies actually impact people who want to vote. Here's what we know. We know that up to 10% of the voting age public in the United States does not have a photo ID. They don't drive. For whatever reason, they've lost contact with their birth certificate. Maybe they were, if they're of a certain age, including our own Secretary of State, they were born at home, so they don't actually have a physical birth certificate. So there's a range of things that happen to people that upwards of 10% of people don't have that. We know that those people are predominantly people of color, and we know that they're predominantly older. So that's the demographic that we know don't have that ID. I think what's important is that if you look at the Wisconsin example before the 2016 presidential election, the federal court ordered the state, if they were going to require the ID, to make IDs available, even temporary ones available through state offices, and to make sure that they accommodated people who came in who couldn't afford them, didn't have all of the documentations they might otherwise have, to figure out alternative ways. And what was presented to the court, unfortunately, after the election, was evidence that state officials actually went out of their way to deny people access to those IDs. So that even if the number, again, I take the argument from people, can it really be as high as 200,000? We have to remember this is a state that was decided by fewer than 20,000 votes.
So if it were
so if it's just 1/10 of that number, does that make a difference? And we don't know. I mean, those votes could have split, and there's no telling. But the fact is that what we've done is we've created these policies that actually have the effect of denying people access to the ballot box. And one of the things we've prided ourselves in the country is the idea of expanding that access. And I think that's really kind of the question.
Well, so what do we do about it? How do we fight back?
Well, I think we do a couple of things. I think, first of all, I think people have to look at these issues and sort of figure out what's going on, what's happening in their state, what's happening in their area, and then not be afraid. There's always been this thing that my voice doesn't make a difference. Right?
Yeah,
this is the thing we all hear. I mean, it's this
I'm just
idea
one person, what can I do?
I'm just one person, what can I do? Here's the thing. If the recent coverage and debate over the health care bill teaches us anything, voices matter. People listen. When people, and part of it is for people to figure out in their lives, in their families, in their community, is who's being affected, and then raise those voices up. Let people know how this impacts them. Their communities and the people they know and the people they love, the people that they care about. The fact of the matter is that those stories actually end up being the thing that makes the difference. Because here's the thing. 7 years of repeal and replace in healthcare was just a slogan. When you started actually having the people show up who would lose their healthcare, it's a much tougher vote. So I think part of it is to find those stories and to be able to tell them. If you have one of those stories, is to be able to tell it. But I think if you look at all of these issues, in general, we've seen this incredible outpouring of support, whether it's for the ACLU or for our partner organizations. I think there's really two things. The first is to find some place like ours or Planned Parenthood or whomever it is, and to get information and then to utilize it in a way to really speak out to those in elected office. I think that really matters more than anything because, Congress, it turns out Congress really does have to run every 2 years, and they're going to listen on occasion.
Unless they're in completely safe districts.
Unless they're in completely safe districts. But the other thing is, and I think this is more important than anything else, is that one of the things that had happened over the last, I would say,
and we've got about 15 seconds, so this has to be quick.
Is that we really have to think about crossing over and thinking about other issues. If you aren't someone who's affected by something but you're troubled by it, is to speak out for that person. And whether that's on reproductive rights or immigration or whatever, is being there for one another, I think, is really the most important thing.
We're all in this together.
We're all in it. We, as Franklin said, certainly we will hang together or we shall hang separately.
Yes. So, Ed, thank you so much.
Thanks
it's always
so much,
a pleasure
Kevin.
having you here.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19. And you can see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So till next time, thank you and good night.
News.